The Mitford Sisters were British aristocrats who gained immense notoriety in the 20th century for often scandalous reasons. As such, some were hated, but others were loved. The six have been dubbed the Duchess, the Fascist, the Communist, the Nazi, the Novelist, and the other one. So why were they so controversial? And just how did they become famous? Join me as we go deep into the life of each sister. Before we explore the lives of each sister, we need to look at their family history. The Mitford family from which the six Mitford sisters hailed can trace its origins in England back before the Norman conquest of the country in the 11th century. At the time William the Conqueror crossed over from France with his Norman knights to conquer England, the family was headed by Sir John de Mitford, who ruled Mitford Castle, Northumberland, in the north of the country on the Scottish border. Incredibly, the Mitfords retained a landed presence here for the next 800 years. The sisters' father was David Bertram Ogilvy Freeman Mitford, the second Baron Redesdale in the English peerage. He was notoriously eccentric, but the family was relatively accomplished. For instance, his great-great-grandfather had been a noted British historian in the early 19th century. Their mother was Sidney Bowles, whose father Thomas was a Member of Parliament and prominent writer and publisher who founded several well-known British magazines of the time, including the original Vanity Fair. David and Sidney had 7 children in all following their marriage in 1904. The eldest, Nancy, was born just months after their wedding. Pamela was born in 1907 and was followed soon after by Thomas, their only son, in January 1909. Their third daughter was born in 1910. There was a lull before Unity was born in August 1914, just days after the outbreak of the First World War in which David served in France. Jessica was born in 1917, followed finally by Deborah in 1920. Thomas would only live until his mid-30s, as he was killed in service in the final months of the Second World War in 1945, fighting in the Pacific Theatre. The sisters, though, would nearly all go on to live long lives. These were shaped significantly by their parents, with David being staunchly conservative, while Sarah flirted throughout the 1930s and 1940s with fascism. The family would go on to become one of the most notorious in England during the 20th century, with some members lauded and others scorned. Nancy Mitford was born on the 28th of November 1904 in London. Nancy's childhood was a peculiar one. Her parents were eccentrics, who briefly experimented with a novel idea for the time that children should not be rebuked or spoken to in anger. The result, according to the biographers of the eldest Mitford sister, was that she became a troublesome child, who would descend into fits of rage if she did not get what she wanted. As a result, her parents abandoned their experiment and began parenting in a manner more typical of the times. Nancy and her siblings were educated for the most part by private tutors and governesses at the family estate of Redesdale. It was often a strained environment, one in which the sisters fought over many issues, and in which Nancy was known to be a domineering figure who teased her younger siblings. Yet, there were also signs of her future work as a writer emerging in the late 1910s and early 1920s. Nancy, for instance, took the lead in editing and producing a family magazine called The Boiler, which she and her siblings contributed pieces to. At this early stage in her literary development, Nancy primarily composed murder and mystery stories. Nancy turned 18 in November 1922. This was an era in which one's debutante ball was still a major event, one made even more so by the fact that Nancy's life had been so sheltered for most of her youth, and the event marked Nancy's entry into British high society at the time. The following summer, she was introduced to the royal court and met King George V at Buckingham Palace. Nancy soon established herself as part of the Bright Young Things, a group of daughters and sons of the British aristocracy in the 1920s who became known for their artistic pursuits and bohemian lifestyles. This included some of the Mitford sisters, the Sitwell siblings, Anthony Power, John Betjeman, and several others. Eventually, many of these went on to become noted writers, painters, and poets in the 1930s and 1940s. None, though, became as accomplished as Evelyn Waugh, the author of Brideshead Revisited, which was published in 1945. Ward and Nancy became close friends and would remain so for the rest of their lives. The bright young things became well known at the time for throwing lavish parties in London and for their heavy drinking and drug use. This was a time of heightened partying in many countries, driven by the incredible economic boom which had followed from the end of the First World War, and the social scene in England became very extravagant. In part owing to Ward's encouragement, and in part because of her own long-held interest in doing so, Nancy began writing in a more sustained manner in the second half of the 1920s. This was not a new departure for her family. Nancy's great-great-great-grandfather on her father's side had been a well-respected historian in the early 19th century, while her maternal grandfather, Thomas Bowles, had been a considerable writer himself, who established several prominent magazines in the 19th century, notably the original Vanity Fair. Thus, Nancy's decision to become a writer was in keeping with the family background. By the end of the 1920s, she was writing a regular column for the Lady magazine. Soon after acquiring this position, she began work on a fictional novel, one which would eventually be published in the spring of 1931 as Highland Fling. It recounts a meeting of some aristocrats at a party in the Scottish Highlands, one which was characterised by excess and acrimony between the guests. The work contained elements of a thinly disguised biography, and many of the characters in Highland Fling were based on friends and acquaintances of Nancy's, amongst the bright young things. Her subsequent efforts in the 1930s, such as Christmas Pudding published in 1932, and Wigs on the Green which appeared in print in 1935, continued this pattern of drawing on her own experiences. In the midst of working on these books, Nancy's love life had shifted. In the late 1920s, she had been seeing Hamish St. Clair Erskine, a son of the Earl of Roslin. However, the relationship was unfulfilling, primarily because Erskine was gay, though Nancy appears to have been unaware of this fact at the time. She was also seemingly oblivious to the fact that Erskine had been in a relationship with her brother Tom at Oxford University, while he was also dating Nancy. Nevertheless, their affair continued until 1933, when Hamish abruptly ended it. Shocked, Nancy quickly began a relationship with Peter Rodd, the son of the newly ennobled Sir Rennell Rodd, 1st Baron Rennell. They married in December 1933 after just a few months of courtship. However, the marriage was almost immediately unhappy, with Peter engaging in extramarital affairs. They would never have children, though Nancy became pregnant on several occasions, but suffered miscarriages in each instance. By the late 1930s, it was clear to many that it was a marriage in name only to avoid divorce, which still carried a social stigma. In the late 1930s, Nancy spent time editing the family letters of the Stanley family of Adelaide, to whom the Mitfords were distantly related. In early 1939, she went to the south of France and there helped to care for wounded Spaniards who had crossed the border along the Pyrenees, fleeing from General Francisco Franco's regime as it solidified its control of Spain in the dying stage of the Spanish Civil War. This experience hardened her political views against fascism, a political ideology which several of her younger siblings were keen advocates of, notably Diana, who had married Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists in 1936. When the Second World War broke out in the autumn of 1939, it divided the Mitford family. Nancy supported British opposition to the Germans and volunteered in numerous different capacities as an aid worker during the war. In the course of it, in September 1942, she met Gaston Pawlowski, a Frenchman who was living in London as an aide to General Charles de Gaulle, the head of the Free French government in exile. She soon became smitten with Pawlowski, who was evidently the real love of her life, though Pawlowski's attraction to her was less enthusiastic. As a result, when the war ended in 1945, Nancy relocated to France shortly afterwards and went to live in Paris. There she lived apart from Pawlowski, though near to his apartment. Her marriage to Peter was effectively over by this time, though they would remain married on paper and did not finally divorce until 1957. By the time Nancy settled in France, she had finally achieved the literary success that she had long aspired to. Her fifth book, The Pursuit of Love, was published in 1945. A romantic comedy, it became a major hit in post-war Britain, where readers were enthusiastic about an escapist novel at the end of 6 bleak years of war. It sold 200,000 copies in its first year on sale and made Nancy an established writer in Britain for the first time. On the back of it, she was offered a position writing a regular column for the Sunday Times and became financially self-sufficient. Despite the success of The Pursuit of Love and her subsequent fiction works such as Love in Cold Climate published in 1949 and Don't Tell Alfred published in 1960, which formed a trilogy alongside The Pursuit of Love, Nancy moved away from writing fiction in the early 1950s, developing instead a keen interest in writing historical biographies. The first such work which she published was a book on Madame de Pompadour, a famous mistress of King Louis XV of France between 1745 and 1751. The book was denigrated by historians and critics as a piece of popcorn history, which focused more on the scandalous elements of de Pompadour's life rather than the hard historical facts of the time. But it sold well, and Nancy would spend much of the remainder of her life writing historical biographies. Throughout these years, Nancy's relationship with Pulowski remained a curious one. They never lived together, though they spent much of their free time in each other's company. However, they would not marry, and Pulowski was unfaithful, engaging in a string of other relationships and gaining a reputation in post-war France as a notorious womanizer. Moreover, as the years went by, his work often ensured that he had little time to see Mitford, serving as vice president of the French Parliament for several years in the 1950s, and thereafter being sent to Italy as the French ambassador to the country in 1957. He would spend 5 years there, during which Nancy rarely saw him. Moreover, their relationship remained a secret for the most part, and although Nancy finally divorced Rod in 1957, she and Pulowski never married. She also continued to write and publish during these years. 3 more works of historical biography followed from Madame de Pompadour. These were Voltaire in Love, a study of the 18th century French philosopher's relationship with Marquis de Châtelet in the 1740s, and studies of King Louis XIV of France and King Frederick II of Prussia, 2 of early modern Europe's foremost rulers. Her study of Voltaire in particular was received well, and is still considered a substantial study today of the emotional life of the intellectual heavyweight of the French Enlightenment, while the study of Louis XIV was a well-produced coffee table book with many illustrations of Versailles Palace. It sold well as a result. By the time she was writing these books in the late 1950s and 1960s, Nancy was in increasingly poor health. In particular, she suffered from frequent headaches and diminishing eyesight, and feared that she was going blind. She was also increasingly downhearted at the decline of her relationship with Pulowski, whom she saw less and less frequently following his return to Paris from Italy in 1962. Eventually, he married the wealthy Duchess de Sagan in 1969, a move which deeply hurt Mitford. By that time, Nancy had moved to a new home in Versailles, in the suburbs of Paris. She was suffering from cancer by then, from which she would never fully recover. In 1972, she was made a Chevalier of the Légion d'Honneur for her contribution to French letters. Shortly thereafter, she returned to England for medical treatment, but her condition was dire, and she spent the last months of her life in considerable pain. Nancy Mitford died on the 30th of June 1973, aged 68, at home in Versailles. Her remains were cremated and were sent back to England for burial in the family plot. Pamela Mitford was born on the 25th of November 1907 in Wilbury, Wiltshire in southwest England. Pamela was her parents' second child, as Nancy, another daughter, had been born 3 years earlier. The Mitfords had a peculiar childhood, raised by extremely eccentric parents and homeschooled for the most part. Unlike many of her siblings, Pamela never developed a great taste for city life, and even in her childhood she loved the animals on the Mitford country estate. This was a passion which would define much of her adult life. Yet, there were also troublesome aspects to her youth. She and her sisters were strong-willed and highly opinionated on all matter of things. As they grew up, a considerable rivalry developed between them. Nancy, in particular, teased her younger sister remorselessly, but as they grew older, she and Nancy remained closer, whereas the sisters' relationship with the middle sisters, Diana and Unity, and with Tom would become strained by their politics. Pamela's love of the outdoors, animals and horse riding developed despite physical limitations which plagued her in her youth. She suffered from polio, which had left her partially lame in one leg, but she managed to overcome this and led a life which was largely unaffected by it, though the condition did hamper her movements in old age. As Pamela grew up, her interest in all things rural, from gardening to cooking with foraged ingredients, became even stronger. Her affection for animals was also notable and would characterise much of her life. She spent time in London amongst the high society of the bright young things, with which her older sister Nancy and her younger sister Diana were associated, but her heart remained in the countryside. The poet John Betjeman, whom Pamela knew in the 1920s and 1930s, and who was clearly besotted by her for a time, described her in an unpublished poem of his entitled The Mitford Sisters as, quote, Miss Pamela, most rural of them all, on account of her love of farm animals and a preference for living a quiet life in the countryside, tending gardens and looking after horses, ponies and dogs. The early 1930s were peculiar years for a young woman who was interested in the simple things in life. The Mitford family politics were deeply divided at this time. The sisters' mother leaned toward fascism, which was spreading across continental Europe at an alarming speed during these years. Sydney's political views rubbed off on two of her daughters, Diana and Unity, and her and David's only son, Tom. And these political views became political ties from 1932 onwards, when Diana first became the mistress of Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, and then his wife. These ties ensured that the Mitfords spent time in Germany with senior members of the Nazi regime, where Diana's marriage to Mosley took place in 1936. Yet Pamela seems to never have backed any of Diana, Unity and Tom's political views. Instead, when she and her mother met Adolf Hitler in the mid-1930s, Pamela exchanged recipes for wholemeal bread with the Nazi leader, and her primary interest lay in the baby potatoes which were served at lunch. Such practicalities were typical of Pamela's personality. Her sisters, who called her woman, relied on her for practical advice, and it was noted that, quote, Pam was often right, but seldom listened to. In times of adversity throughout their lives, many of her siblings turned to her as a rock of stability. In the mid-1930s, Pamela began a relationship with Derek Jackson. They bonded over a shared love of equestrian activities, Jackson being a noted jockey, riding in the Grand National at Aintree in 1935. He hailed from a wealthy Welsh family, his father, Sir Charles Jackson, having been a chairman of the News of the World, but Jackson was independently successful himself, having emerged as one of Britain's leading atomic physicists in the 1930s, and acquiring a position at Oxford University. Pamela and Derek's relationship has long been understood to have been one of convenience. Derek was bisexual, while Pamela was almost certainly a lesbian, but since she was so private about her personal life, there is little concrete evidence to confirm this. They married in 1936, and whatever their relationship might have been in private, it is clear that they were close to one another. Yet, they did not have children, and Pamela would never become a mother, despite her sister Jessica once noting that she would have made an ideal parent. When the Second World War broke out in the autumn of 1939, Derek was often called away from their farm in Berkshire. His abilities as a physicist made him valuable to the government, and he spent much of the early years of the war helping to improve the Royal Air Force's air defence system and radars. Consequently, he flew more than 1,000 hours as a navigator during the conflict. In stark contrast to Pamela's husband's wartime service, in the summer of 1940, her sister Diana and Oswald Mosley were arrested on account of their ties to Nazi Germany. The Nazis had just conquered France, and with the Blitz of Britain beginning in an effort to bomb or starve Britain into surrendering, Nazi sympathisers like the Mosleys were arrested as a potential fifth column in the country, who would feed information to Berlin and possibly work to undermine the British war effort from within. Thus, Diana would remain under arrest until November 1943. The upshot of this was that some of her children were taken in by Pamela and Derek at Rignall House, their country farm in Berkshire. Despite her sister's political affiliations, Pamela wrote regularly to Diana at Holloway Prison and never disowned her, in contrast to the eldest of the Mitfords, Nancy, who denounced Diana as, quote, sinister woman. Eventually, as the defeat of Nazi Germany became inevitable in the course of 1943, the Mosleys were released from prison and allowed to remain under house arrest, at which time Alexander and Desmond left Pamela and Derek's home. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Derek left his academic position and they relocated to Ireland to live at Tullymane Castle near Fairford in County Tipperary in the Irish Midlands. Built in the early 19th century, the castle was the centrepiece of a stud farm, and Pamela was in her element here, with her love for all things rural, as was Derek, owing to the fact that a major hunting meet was held here. Their decision to relocate to Ireland was largely owing to a desire to avoid high post-war taxes which were being imposed on the landed gentry in Britain in the aftermath of the war to pay for the enormously expensive conflict. At Tullymane, Pamela was not entirely shut off from her remaining sisters. Deborah had married Andrew Cavendish, a son of the 10th Duke of Devonshire in 1941, and a few years later, he had become the heir to the Cavendish estate, which included Lismore Castle in County Waterford in Ireland, not far to the south of Tullymane. Thus, in the spring and early summer, Deborah would visit Ireland, while guests at Tullymane also included her elder sister Nancy and her lifelong literary friend Evelyn Waugh, author of Brideshead Revisited, whom Pamela also knew from the social circles they had moved in London during the 1920s and 1930s. A perhaps less welcoming addition to the Mitford presence in Ireland was the arrival of Pamela's younger sister Diana in 1951, with her husband Oswald Moseley, after they purchased a house in Galway. The Moseleys had become social exiles in post-war Britain, and had decided to leave the country. Pamela and Derek's early years at Tullymane were happy ones, but while she was content to remain in the Irish countryside with her horses, dogs and vegetable gardens, Derek eventually grew restless and wanted to return to the lab. He began spending more and more time away in England, and this, combined with their complicated sexualities, led to them divorcing in 1950. The split was formalised the following year. They sold Tullymane Castle, and Derek headed to take up a position at the National Centre for Scientific Research in Paris, but Pamela worked out an arrangement whereby she continued to rent Tullymane from the buyer even after they had sold it. She stayed there until 1958. During the years that Pamela and Derek had lived together at Tullymane, a friend of theirs, an Italian horse rider and trainer by the name of Giuditta Tomasini, had been a frequent visitor there. She continued to call regularly throughout the 1950s after Derek and Pamela separated, and she and Pamela became companions, though the exact nature of their relationship from a sexual standpoint remains somewhat unclear. In 1958, when she elected to leave Tullymane, Pamela relocated to Switzerland to live with Tomasini. Evidently there was little disguising their relationship at this point, as Pamela's sister Jessica said she'd become a you-know-what-bian, and referred to Tomasini as Pamela's, quote, German wife, though why she described the Italian woman as German remains something of a mystery. Pamela and she were evidently happy here for many years, and she lived in Switzerland throughout most of the 1960s. Eventually, they decided to part ways, but Pamela did not leave Switzerland until her dogs, many of which were old at the time, had died, as she was unwilling to force them to relocate to England in their old age. It was an indication of where her priorities lay throughout her life. When she eventually did leave Switzerland in 1972, it was to live in the rural Cotswolds in Gloucestershire. Her return to England brought her the distinction of being the woman who introduced the Appenzeller Spitz Holbein breed of chicken to Britain from Switzerland. Pamela's old age was spent in rural England with her animals and garden, yet it was not an entirely quiet and solitary life. She visited Ireland on occasion when Deborah was at Lismore, and despite the family's very differing politics, she spent some winters in South Africa with Diana, where the Moseleys' political views did not make them persona non grata of the Afrikaner community in the context of apartheid. In the 1980s, she belatedly had a brief television career. In 1980, she appeared in a documentary entitled Nancy Mitford, a portrait by her sisters, in which she offered numerous recollections of her older sister while sitting by the River Windrush in Gloucestershire and posing by her ponies on her farm. 4 years later, she was invited on a chat show to discuss chickens, a performance which was evidently noteworthy enough for Deborah to ironically state that Pamela should have her own chat show, exclusively on the subject of poultry. Pamela was staying with a friend in London in the early 1990s when she fell down a flight of stairs and broke 2 bones in the leg which had been weak throughout her life on account of her childhood polio. She had surgery but never fully recovered, and died in hospital on the 12th of April 1994 at the age of 86. True to her equine passions throughout her life, with her last words she is believed to have inquired what horse had won the Grand National at Aintree 3 days earlier. Diana Mitford was born on the 17th of June 1910 in London, England. She was the third daughter and fourth child of David Freeman Mitford, 2nd Baron Ruysdael, and Sidney Freeman Mitford, whose maiden name was Bowles, and who hailed from a literary family. Diana, like the other Mitford children, grew up in a somewhat isolated environment, being homeschooled on their parents' estate in Gloucestershire and Oxfordshire. Yet, in 1926, she was briefly sent to be schooled in Paris for about 6 months. She cannot have known it at the time, but she would live much of her later life in the French capital. Even by that time, Diana had developed an easy charm which pulled people into her circle, and her younger sisters, Unity, Jessica and Deborah, looked up to her rather than the two eldest Mitford sisters, Nancy and Pamela. Eventually the spell would break for Jessica and Deborah, but Unity's adoration for her sister would contribute to her own tragic life story. The Mitfords had long remained secluded in Oxfordshire, but by the 1920s the eldest sisters, Nancy and Pamela, had been introduced to the royal court and into London society, socialising with some of the mid-20th century's most prominent writers and artistic figures in their youth. Each of the Mitford sisters responded to these newfound freedoms in different ways. Diana, who was well noted by the late 1920s as the prettiest of the Mitford sisters, married almost as soon as she was released from the shackles of the Mitford estate in Oxfordshire. When she was just 18 years of age, she secretly got engaged to the handsome and charming Brian Guinness, heir to the Irish brewing dynasty, whose surname graces pints of porter all over the world. When she informed her parents, they were initially reluctant to allow her to marry due to her young age. However, they eventually gave in, and when Diana and Guinness married in January 1929, it was one of the weddings of the year in British high society. Her marriage to Guinness was something of a culture shock for Diana. The family was incredibly wealthy, and with armies of staff and servants at their homes in Ireland and England, Diana's new mother-in-law expressed amazement at the fact that Diana was able to fry an egg. The couple lived on an allowance of £20,000 a year until Brian would come into his inheritance, and along with a mansion in London, they had a home in Dublin, not far from the Guinness brewery, and an estate in Hampshire. Two sons, Jonathan and Desmond, followed in 1930 and 1931, but before they'd even left infancy, Diana was being drawn elsewhere. In February 1932, Diana met Sir Oswald Mosley while attending a party at the house of Emerald Cunard in London. Mosley was judged by many to be one of the most promising politicians in Britain in the 1920s, one who had previously been a member of the Conservative Party before crossing the aisle to the Labour Party in the mid-1920s. When Labour entered government in 1929, he was appointed as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. However, when the Labour Party membership rejected a memorandum which it had drawn up in 1930, one which outlined a plan for how to reduce the massive levels of unemployment which had emerged in Britain following the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, he left Labour too and started the New Party, as it was originally called. In 1932, right around the time he met Diana, the New Party became the British Union of Fascists, with Mosley as its leader. Despite the fact that both Diana and Mosley were married and their 14-year age gap, they were soon having an affair. Shortly thereafter, Diana decided to leave her husband and became Mosley's mistress, horrifying her family and scandalising British society. Oswald, on the other hand, refused to leave his wife, Lady Cynthia Mosley, but she died not too long after in 1933, due to complications arising from peritonitis. Despite Diana's divorce and the death of Lady Cynthia, the couple wouldn't marry until 1936, as Mosley didn't commit to the relationship for several years. For example, he was briefly involved in a relationship with his sister-in-law, Lady Alexandra Metcalfe, after his first wife died. Oswald and Diana finally married on the 6th of October 1936. This took place in Germany, in one of the homes of the Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, and Adolf Hitler was even present at the event. By that time, Diana had regularly been visiting Germany with Oswald to attend Nazi rallies in Nuremberg, and Oswald forged ties to the German fascists as he believed that his party would assume control of Britain one day. Two sons followed soon after their marriage, Alexander in 1938 and Max in 1940. Though her marital affairs had led to tensions with the Mitford family, Diana's mother Sydney, brother Tom and sister Unity shared her affinity for fascism, and there is no doubting that Diana was a committed fascist. She was not blindly led into political extremism in Britain as a result of some infatuation with her new husband, though her views in later life on the racial policies of the Nazis and their genocidal actions were complicated. At certain times she expressed some horror for what had happened, but on others, her statements were more neutral. Nevertheless, her politics in the 1930s caused a complete split with her elder sister Nancy. When the Second World War broke out in the autumn of 1939, following Germany's invasion of Poland, Diana and Oswald's political and social position in Britain collapsed. This was in stark contrast to the summer of 1939, before hostilities broke out, when a British Union of Fascist rally in London had drawn 30,000 attendees, one of the biggest political rallies in British history. Compromised by his early support for the Nazis, Oswald began calling now for a negotiated peace agreement with Germany. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, given the danger it posed, the British government did not move to ban the British Union of Fascists until the 23rd of May 1940, following the Passage of Treachery Act that day. 5 weeks later, Diana and Oswald were arrested on the back of undoubtedly well-founded fears that the British government had that the Mosleys and their followers would act as a fifth column for the Nazis in England if they were allowed to remain free. Thus, Diana was imprisoned in Holloway Prison in London. Oswald was held separately at first, but in December 1941, the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who knew Mosley well since the 1910s, intervened personally to allow Mosley to be moved to Holloway Prison as well. They remained there until late 1943. By that time, the fate of the war was clear, and the Mosleys were no longer perceived as a grave threat to British security. Consequently, they were released from prison, but remained under house arrest for the remainder of the war. The Mosleys were effectively social outcasts in Britain after the war ended. Nevertheless, Oswald attempted to revive his political career, in large part by reimagining himself as an advocate of a pan-European state. This was popular at the time, as several Western European states began the process of creating what would eventually become the European Coal and Steel Community, and then the European Economic Community. He also established a union movement as a far-right successor to the British Union of Fascists in 1948, but it didn't gain any traction in the short term. Ultimately, the Mosleys were unable to leave behind the shame which came with their association of the Nazis in the 1930s. Accordingly, once they were given their passports back by the government in 1949, they began making plans to leave Britain. Diana, Oswald and their two sons left Britain in 1951, relocating first to Ireland, where they settled first in Galway and then at Fermoy in County Cork. Yet, they spent most of their years in exile living at Orsay in Paris, with occasional visits to South Africa as well, where their politics were far more acceptable to the far-right apartheid regime run by the National Party. It was a curious life in exile. Oswald was frequently unfaithful, and Diana was certainly aware of his affairs, but ignored them for the most part. When asked about her ties to the Nazis in the 1930s, she expressed outward revulsion for the Holocaust and the genocidal and racial policies of the Nazi regime, but she also refused to entirely disavow her friendships with Hitler and the other senior Nazis. In one interview she had the following to say: "They'll go on persecuting me until I say Hitler was ghastly. Well, what's the point in saying that? We all know that he was a monster, that he did very cruel and terrible things, but that doesn't alter the fact that he was obviously an interesting figure. It was fascinating for me at 24 to sit and talk to him, to ask him questions and get answers, even if they weren't true ones. No torture on earth would get me to say anything different." In the many interviews she gave over the years, and accounts of which her friends and acquaintances provided, there is little doubting that she was anti-Semitic, once pondering in an interview with the Guardian newspaper that Europe's Jews should have been relocated to Uganda, a thinly disguised allusion to a Nazi plan to deport the continent's Jewish people to the African island of Madagascar, which had briefly been considered in 1940. While the Mosleys were effectively unable to involve themselves in any substantial fashion in British politics after the war, Both she and Oswald wrote and published extensively during these decades. In order to facilitate their work, they established Euphorion Books, their own publishing company, which they named after a character in Wolfgang Goethe's Faust. Mosley subsequently translated Goethe's work and published it through Euphorion. Much of Diana's writing was political. For instance, she edited The European for 6 years between 1953 and 1959 while living in France, a political and cultural magazine which tried to further many of the Mosleys' political ideas. Curiously, the magazine was in favour of British entry into the newly founded European Economic Community. More broadly, the European included contributions from the American poet Ezra Pound, who had been a fan of Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism, and the South African poet Roy Campbell, and the British writer and royal advocate Henry Williamson, who, when not creating the character of Tarka the Otter, was a supporter of European fascism in the 1930s. Diana also published several books. One of these, The Duchess of Windsor, published in 1980, was a biography of Wallis Simpson, who King Edward VIII's desire to marry in 1936 had caused the abdication crisis that year. Edward and Wallis, by that time the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, had lived next door to Diana and Oswald in Paris, and had also seen controversy by visiting Germany in 1937, and meeting Hitler and other Nazi leaders after Edward lost his throne. 2 personal memoirs also appeared. First came A Life of Contrasts in 1977, which was a straightforward autobiography, and Loved Ones, published in 1985, in which she reflected on some of the famous figures she had known over the years, including her sisters, and the author of Brideshead Revisited, Evil in War. Finally, Diana wrote for several other prominent publications, including articles for The Tatler in the late 1960s, and as a book reviewer, both for the New Statesman and the London Evening Standard from the 1970s through to the 1990s. Her background and her writings, including a defense of Magda Goebbels' decision to kill her 6 children in the Führer bunker at the end of the Second World War, caused controversy, and infamous clashes with the late Christopher Hitchens and Max Hastings, a prominent historian of the Second World War and newspaper editor. Diana's husband Oswald died on the 3rd of December 1980 at Orsay in Paris. Many obituaries and news reports noted the passing of the leader of the British fascist movement, but his demise was not greeted with the sort of outpouring of anger at Mosley's political career as it might have occurred had he died closer to the Second World War. Many people had simply forgotten the Mosleys, or had not been alive in the 1930s and early 1940s. After her husband's death, Diana remained in France and continued to write extensively, though she lost her position as a book reviewer at the London Evening Standard in the mid-1990s, when Max Hastings determined that he didn't want any more reviews by, quote, Bloody Lady Hitler run in the paper. Her reputation as a leading female British fascist was still alive and well 50 years after the war ended. Diana eventually died in Paris on the 11th of August 2003, following complications arising from a stroke she had suffered a week earlier. This was compounded by the heat wave which hit Western Europe that late summer, as temperatures topped 40 degrees Celsius for 10 days in a row in France. Diana was 93 years of age at the time. She was buried back in England in Oxfordshire, in the Mitford family plot next to her sisters. Obituaries were scornful of her ties to the Nazis, though debated her own political views, which remain somewhat unclear and contested even today. Unity Mitford was born on the 8th of August 1914. Her parents, David Freeman Mitford, 2nd Baron Riesdale, and Sidney Mitford, née Bowles, decided to name her Unity as a symbolic gesture, owing to the fact that Britain had entered what would eventually become known as the First World War 4 days before she was born. Although initially of no significance, Unity was conceived in the town of Swashticker, Ontario in Canada, which is curious when considering how her life played out. Unlike her older siblings, who had been almost entirely homeschooled, by the time Unity was of school-going age, the family had relocated to Oxfordshire, and her parents had become more willing to allow their younger daughters to attend formal schooling. Consequently, she attended St Margaret's School at Bushey in Hertfordshire. As a child, she struggled to assert herself within the large family unit. By the time she was in her early teens, her older sisters were already prominent figures on the London social scene, and they were all opinionated and strong-willed, with various literary and social ambitions. Amongst them, Unity struggled to carve out her own identity, and this would later play a part in how her life developed. In the early 1930s, Unity began to show an affinity for fascist politics, which was sweeping across Europe in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression which followed. Her mother, older sister Diana, and brother Tom shared her political views, and from 1932 onwards, when Diana began seeing Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, the family became tied into Britain's own fledgling fascist politics. This contrasted sharply with Unity's younger sister Jessica, who had a growing affinity with communist politics. The pair shared a room in the family home in Oxfordshire, and during the early 1930s, it was divided down the middle with a chalk line. Jessica decorated her side with pictures of the first leader of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin, and the hammer and sickle insignia of Russian communism, while Unity put up a photo of Adolf Hitler, the leader of the German Nazi Party, and a swastika, the Nazi symbol. It would be easy to dismiss these actions as two teenage sisters trying to antagonize each other, but this political divide became all too real in the mid-1930s. Well, Jessica would eventually elope to Spain to join the communist side in the Spanish Civil War, but before even that had happened, Unity had headed off to Germany with Diana to accompany Oswald Mosley to the annual Nazi rally in the southern German city of Nuremberg in the mid-autumn of 1933. There she met Adolf Hitler for the first time, and quickly became infatuated with him. Following this initial meeting with Hitler in 1933, Unity became determined to win her way into the German leader's inner circle. She later stated of this initial contact that, "The first time I saw him, I knew there was no one I would rather meet." By this time, Unity was convinced about Hitler, and this soon turned into worship. She was now set on being as near to Hitler as she possibly could, and to win his affections, despite the fact that he was already into his mid-40s and she was not yet 20. As a result, Unity soon returned to Germany in the summer of 1934 and enrolled in a language school in Munich. Unity was so obsessed with the German leader that she soon began stalking him, taking note of his daily activities and tracking which hotels and cafes he frequented. It wasn't long until she noticed that Hitler would often eat in the Osteria Bavaria in Munich, so she decided to sit near the entrance every day, and when Hitler came in, he would notice her. Then, after 10 months of sitting in the Osteria Bavaria restaurant, Hitler finally invited her to his table, and after talking for 30 minutes, Hitler picked up the bill. Unity wrote the following to her father about the encounter. "It was the most wonderful and beautiful day of my life, and I am so happy that I wouldn't mind a bit dying. I'd suppose I'm the luckiest girl in the world, for he is the greatest man of all time." Soon, Hitler also became somewhat infatuated with a young blonde British student, who he described as a perfect specimen of Aryan womanhood. He was impressed by her intriguing ties to Germanic culture, such as her middle name Valkyrie, and the fact that Unity's grandfather had been friends with Richard Wagner, one of his idols. It should also be noted that Hitler was an extremely superstitious man, and he believed that Unity was sort of sent to him, as if it was destined. Following this, Hitler began inviting Unity to various party rallies and state events, and he used her to create jealousy in his current partner, Eva Braun, who was 2 years older than Unity. As Unity spent more and more time with the Nazi leader, Braun's psychological state deteriorated, and she attempted to kill herself in May 1935, the second such suicide attempt. After that, records show that Hitler committed to their relationship, seemingly in the belief that Braun had shown adequate loyalty to him in her willingness to take her own life should he reject her. Despite Hitler settling on Eva Braun at this time, Unity continued to move in the German leader's inner circle. She accompanied him during several events held at the Summer Olympics in Berlin in 1936, and was present in Vienna in March 1938 after the Nazis had managed to annex Austria in a bloodless coup. The Nazi leader even arranged for her to be given an apartment in the city of Munich from which a Jewish couple were evicted. In total, it is believed that Unity met Hitler on more than 100 occasions, and this consequently means that she spent more time in the company of the Nazi leader following his ascent to power in 1933 than any other British person. The peculiar sense of unity within the Nazi party was looked at suspiciously by many senior Nazi figures, even if she had gained favour with Hitler. Some worried that she might be a British spy of some kind. Others were simply confounded as to why Hitler allowed her to attend social gatherings of his inner circle, many of whom he had known since the mid-1920s. Yet in time, she won many over. On her copy of Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiographical political manifesto, Unity not only managed to acquire Hitler's signature, but also those of Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, as well as the other most senior members of the Nazi regime. Unity's political views are quite hard to get a clear picture of. She espoused many of the attitudes of German fascism, including its severe racial antipathy towards the Jewish people and other groups in Eastern Europe. At a Hitler Youth rally in the mid-1930s, she proudly asserted that she was a, quote, Jew hater, and she was ardent in her fascism in other ways. For instance, when in England she would show up to social events wearing the black shirt uniform of the British Union of Fascists, and even attended communist meetings to heckle the speakers. However, whether this was the political outlook of someone who had reflected on fascist theories and ideology and began to advocate it, or was the immature actions of a confused young woman who really wanted to belong to something, regardless of what that something might be, is open to debate. In one respect alone do we see Unity ploughing her own path when it came to her political outlook. She was unquestionably a British nationalist. As the years went by through the late 1930s, and war between Germany and Britain became more and more likely, she was known to express her desire that the Nazis would find a way to reach an agreement with Britain and avoid war with her native country. Unity made her feelings in this respect known to Hitler, and in the end, her inability to reconcile her worship of Hitler and German fascism with her love for her homeland would be her downfall. Hitler had informed both Diana and Unity in the summer of 1939 that war between Britain and Germany was inevitable, as the Nazis fully intended to invade Poland within a matter of weeks, and Britain and France had made it clear that such an action would result in a state of war existing between them and Germany. As the fateful day approached, the two sisters deliberated on what to do. Ultimately, Diana took the decision to return home with Oswald Mosley, and the Mosleys no doubt began preparing to acquire a position of some prominence in Britain if the Nazis succeeded in defeating their own native country. Unity took the opposite decision and remained in Germany, despite her family's pleas for her to return to England. Tragically, Unity's psychological state was very poor in the days leading up to the outbreak of the Second World War. Before Diana left Germany, her younger sister had told her that she might take her own life if the two countries ended up at war, and so it proved. When Britain declared war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939, following the Nazi invasion of Poland 2 days earlier, Unity shot herself in the head with a pistol in Munich. But the bullet did not kill her, though it did become lodged in her head. After her attempted suicide, Unity was sent to a Munich hospital where she remained unconscious for the next 2 months. During this time, Hitler visited her on several occasions and paid her medical bills. When she finally regained consciousness, she was sent across the Alpine border to neutral Switzerland. There, her mother and youngest sister Deborah arrived at the city of Bern and arranged for her to be brought back home to England. When they eventually arrived to Switzerland in January 1940, they found Unity in a dreadful condition. Deborah, writing over 60 years later, described her sister in the following words. "We were not prepared for what we found. The person lying in bed was desperately ill. She had lost 2 stone, was all huge eyes and matted hair, untouched since the bullet went through her skull. The bullet was still in her head, inoperable, the doctor said. She could not walk, talked with difficulty, and was a changed personality, like one who had had a stroke. Not only was her appearance shocking, she was a stranger, someone we did not know." Her mother and Deborah arranged for her to be brought back to England with the bullet still in Unity's head. There, despite calls for her to be interred as a Nazi sympathiser, as Diana was from the summer of 1940 onwards, Unity remained at the family home in Oxford. This was in part thanks to the intervention of the Home Secretary John Anderson at the behest of her father, and because she wasn't deemed a threat given her physical and psychological state. There she was cared for by her mother, but despite relearning how to walk and carry out some basic tasks, she never really regained any of her mental faculties. An assessment by one of her medical team a few years later described her as having the mental age of a 10-year-old. In spite of this, Unity is alleged to have had a relationship with the RAF pilot officer John Andrews. He was stationed nearby, and although he was a married man and father, the affair would last until the 11th of September 1941. It only ended as MI5 caught wind of what was occurring, and they immediately reported it to Herbert Morrison, the Home Secretary at the time. It was also rumoured at this time that Unity drives about the countryside and picks up airmen, etc., and interrogates them. As a result, Andrews was reposted to the far north of Scotland, where he possibly later died in a Spitfire crash in 1945. In the late spring of 1948, Unity became ill while on a family visit to the tiny island of Inchkenneth off the west coast of Scotland. This was a piece of land which the Mitfords had acquired some years earlier. The bullet in her head had moved, and her brain began to swell. She was taken to hospital, but doctors decided it was not possible to operate. Shortly afterwards, on the 28th of May 1948, she died from meningitis, aged 33. In death, a number of rumours and conspiracy theories attached themselves to Unity. One emerged after reports concerning her made by MI5 were declassified in 2002. At the time, a British journalist, Martin Bright, published an article in The Observer in which he speculated that Unity had not shot herself at all, but that the injury had likely been fabricated to avoid her being arrested on her return to Britain. The article by Bright occasioned a stern response by Deborah Mitford in the pages of the same newspaper. Bright accepted he'd been wrong in a subsequent article in the New Statesman, published in 2007. A second conspiracy theory which concerned Unity also involved Martin Bright. In the same New Statesman article in 2007, he stated that following his initial publication in 2002, he had received a tip that Unity had actually returned to Britain pregnant in 1940 and had given birth to a child at a maternity hospital in Oxford. Bright consequently speculated that Unity might have been carrying Hitler's child, and that the Nazi leader's offspring had thus lived unknowingly in Britain throughout the second half of the 20th century. A Channel 4 documentary entitled Hitler's British Girl was subsequently aired late in 2007, but the claims remained entirely speculative, as no record of Unity giving birth in Oxford in 1940 was ever uncovered, though this was not uncommon, as birth records for the first years of the war were patchy, given the unrest caused by the conflict. Jessica Lucy Freeman Mitford, who would be known as Decca by those who knew her from her early years onwards, was born on the 11th of September 1917 at Astle Manor in Oxfordshire. Jessica and her siblings had a somewhat dysfunctional upbringing. Their parents were eccentrics who largely homeschooled them, though by the time that Jessica was born, this idea had been relaxed somewhat, and Jessica had some limited formal schooling, though she was largely self-taught in terms of much of her reading and political views. By the early 1930s, as Jessica entered her teenage years, the Mitford family was becoming increasingly divided politically. The middle Mitford sisters Diana and Unity, and the sole brother Tom, were advocates of fascism. Moreover, when Diana began a relationship with Oswald Mosley, the head of the British Union of Fascists in 1932, the family's ties to the British fascist movement became very real indeed, while from 1933, Diana and Unity were spending increasing amounts of time in Germany, attending Nazi gatherings and associating with Hitler and the other leaders of the Nazi Party. This manifested itself at home in Oxfordshire, where Jessica and Unity, who were closest in age, became antagonistic towards each other, as Jessica increasingly favoured socialism and communism, the ideological enemy of fascism. As a result, she was known as the Red Sheep of the family. In the spring of 1937, Jessica, at just 19 years of age, made national headlines in Britain. Shortly before this, she had met and quickly fallen in love with Esmond Romilly, a British socialist, anti-fascist, and nephew-in-law of Winston Churchill, the future Prime Minister of Britain and war leader. Mitford and Romilly were being reported on in the newspaper that spring, as they had eloped from Britain and headed for Spain to support the communist and republican movement there in the Civil War against the nationalists, who would eventually fall under the absolute command of General Francisco Franco. Jessica and Esmond arrived to Spain later that spring, where they remained, despite the dispatch of a British warship to the region to try and bring home this daughter of a British aristocrat and nephew-in-law of one of the nation's foremost political figures. However, once their Spanish visas were threatened with revocation, they agreed to pass back over the border to France. There they were married in a civil ceremony at Bayonne on the 18th of May 1937. The young couple remained in France for some time, with hopes of returning to Spain to report on the war, but eventually had to abandon this aim. They consequently returned to London, where Esmond worked on a memoir entitled Boadilla, an account of his time with the English Brigade fighting with the communists in Spain back in 1936, before Jessica joined him on his travels. There they lived in the East End, in an apartment that a friend of Esmond had provided to them. Tragically, a daughter named Jessica after her mother, who was born in December 1937, died the following May from a measles outbreak in the British capital. Jessica and Esmond did not remain in England long after returning there. In February 1939, they emigrated to the United States, where they lived a largely penniless, itinerant lifestyle, despite their affluent backgrounds. Eventually they settled in Greenwich Village in New York, which was already developing its reputation as a bohemian heartland in Lower Manhattan. There Jessica briefly found work at a fashion house, while Esmond attempted to find work as a journalist. This brief period was interrupted when the Second World War broke out in Europe in September 1939, as the fascists Jessica had always deplored went to war with her native country. Esmond immediately headed for Canada to enlist in the Royal Canadian Air Force. Jessica spent the early years of the war living with Virginia and Clifford Durr, two civil rights activists who lived in Washington, D.C. There, Decca gave birth to a daughter that she named Constancia in February 1941. Sadly, Constancia's father would be dead before her first birthday. Esmond went missing in action while flying in an air raid against the city of Hamburg in Germany on the 30th of November 1941. It is assumed that his plane was lost over the North Sea. He was just 23 years of age at the time. Jessica responded to the disappearance of her husband by burying herself in work, volunteering with numerous organizations in the US as the country was drawn into the conflict just a week after Romilly's death following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. During the course of this she met Robert Troyhalf, a Harvard law graduate who became involved in the civil rights movement along with her, even before the war ended. The movement was gathering pace at this time, as civil rights leaders argued that African Americans needed to have equal rights in the United States when they began arriving home from Europe and the Pacific after the war, having fought for their country. Jessica and Troyhalf married in 1943, and she became a US citizen the following year. They had two sons soon after. Nicholas was born in 1944, with Benjamin arriving in 1947. Sadly, Nicholas died when still a child in 1955 after being hit by a bus. By that time his parents were heavily involved in the civil rights movement in America and had also joined the Communist Party of the United States, a political affiliation which became extremely hazardous during Senator Joseph McCarthy's communist witch hunts during the 1950s. As the mother, Jessica clearly left a lot to be desired. Interviewed in 2006, her children, Constancia from her marriage to Romilly, and Benjamin born to her and Troyhalf, stated that she was not a neglectful mother, but her work was always a priority over motherhood. She had little time for the intricacies of raising children, and was not exactly a homemaker, rarely undertaking housework or cooking. Her children called her Decca rather than Mum, while Benjamin claimed that he had largely been raised by his older half-sister rather than his mother. While her parenting style was less than perfect, Jessica flourished as a writer in the post-war period. She contributed to numerous publications in the 1950s before publishing her first book in 1960, a celebrated memoir entitled Ons and Rebels. This autobiographical account of her upbringing presented a picture of herself protesting against the growing inclination of her family towards fascism. In one memorable passage, she describes her sister Unity carving swastikas into the windows of their Oxfordshire manor in the 1930s, over which Jessica subsequently carved the Soviet hammer and sickle. The memoir became a classic and has been widely praised since by figures as notable as Christopher Hitchens and J.K. Rowling. The 1960s were a remarkable period in the history of the United States and in Jessica Mitford's life. It all kicked off for her with encounters with the Ku Klux Klan, the Freedom Riders, and Martin Luther King in 1961. On a research trip to Montgomery, Alabama, one of the most significant sites in the ongoing civil rights movement, Mitford and a friend ended up meeting a group of Freedom Riders, civil rights activists who rode buses between American towns and cities to drum up support for an end to segregation of black and white Americans in the southern states. Shortly afterwards, the group was attacked by a branch of the Ku Klux Klan, following which Mitford made her way to a gathering at which King was a prime speaker. The Klan again sent a group to break up the rally in what was a striking introduction to the South and its politics for Mitford. Shortly thereafter, Mitford's attention was drawn away from the American South to the funeral industry in the United States. She began investigating the more nefarious elements of an industry which pretended to be directed towards helping grieving people, but which Mitford increasingly came to believe was exploiting them. The result in 1963 was a new book entitled The American Way of Death. In this, Mitford argued that funeral directors across the United States were exploiting the shock and grief experienced by the bereaved to convince the families and loved ones of those who had died to pay for an array of services which they didn't really need. This ranged from lavish funeral services and ornate coffins to the provision of grief counsellors. A particularly striking aspect of this was her description of mortuary practices, which were deemed to be so graphic by the standards of the 1960s that Jessica initially struggled to find a publisher. She also described at length the manner in which grieving families were sold designer clothes to dress the dead, and everything from expensive cosmetics and grooming to teeth whitening were added onto bills. Mitford's research was meticulous, based on records she consulted from funeral parlours and state records offices in various parts of the country. The book subsequently became a bestseller and led to a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C. to deliberate on whether the funeral industry needed to be more tightly regulated across the country. With the publication of Ons and Rebels and The American Way of Death, Jessica became a well-established literary figure and social commentator in the United States. She consequently became a regular article writer of numerous publications such as The Atlantic Monthly and Vanity Fair. Many of her pieces continue to skew corporate America and its practices, and Decker became known as one of the preeminent muckrakers of her day. Other journalism focused on the Vietnam War and the draft and the prison system, which at the time was already expanding to become the prison industrial complex of the late 20th and early 21st centuries in America. The latter reporting was published as a book in 1973 entitled Kind and Unusual Punishment: The Prison Business. She also published many other books over the years, including The Trial of Dr. Spock, The Making of a Muckraker, and The American Way of Birth, among others. Decker also taught at several institutions from the late 1960s onwards, notably at San Jose State University, not far from San Francisco, where she had lived with her two surviving children and second husband for the most part since the mid-1940s. This latter position became a cause célèbre in 1973 when Mitford refused to acquiesce to a demand that all staff wear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution of the United States, which, combined with her known position as a prominent communist during the 1950s, led to campus protests both for and against her continued presence as a lecturer there. In 1977, she published a second memoir called A Fine Old Conflict, which largely dealt with her experiences as a member of the US communist movement in the 1940s and 1950s, a movement which she had since departed from and was critical of in many respects. Though there was a lighter side to Decker. In the 1970s, she recorded some music albums, while her television appearances in the 1980s showed a light-hearted, witty side to her personality, despite the seriousness of the topics which she had dealt with in her work over the decades. In the 1990s, she became ill with lung cancer, and eventually died from the disease in the summer of 1996, aged 78. Her wishes, in line with her criticism of the funeral industry over the years, were for an inexpensive ceremony. When the cremation costs were taken out of the equation, it cost just $58. Her ashes were scattered at sea. A memorial service was held in San Francisco, where famous speakers praised her mordant sense of humor and lifelong unorthodoxy. At the time of her death, the San Francisco Chronicle wrote, "In this strangely flat era of diversity, she was the rarest of birds, an exotic creature who rose each morning to become the sun around whom thousands of lives revolved." She was survived by her husband Robert Troyhaff, who died 5 years later, and by her children Constancia Romilly and Benjamin Troyhaff, both of whom are still alive as of the making of this video, and are 82 and 75 respectively. Deborah Vivian Freeman Mitford, who would be known as Deborah by her family and later her in-laws, was born on the 31st of March 1920 at Astle Manor in Oxfordshire. Her childhood was complex. Her parents had wanted a second son, and so she was dismissed to a large extent. They were also very eccentric, and their marriage was extremely strained in Deborah's younger years, eventually collapsing altogether in the late 1930s and early 1940s. As the youngest of the 6 sisters, she was overshadowed and teased extensively by her older siblings, though they had an affection for her, which is typical when you're the youngest member of a large family. Growing up, young Deborah would spend her Saturdays fox hunting, while on Sundays she would ice skate. She had little formal schooling, instead she was primarily taught by a governess and various tutors. Deborah was still only a child when Diana began seeing Oswald Mosley, the leader of the recently formed British Union of Fascists in 1932. The family was soon drawn into the upper echelons of European fascism, with Unity essentially moving to Germany in the mid-1930s, when she was barely an adult, to take up a position as one of Adolf Hitler's closest female confidants. Consequently, when she was still just a teenager, Deborah had the strange experience of dining with Adolf Hitler in Munich, though her recollection of the event many years later emphasized that there was little by way of open conversation. Hitler didn't speak English, and Unity had to translate. By the mid-1930s, the Mitford family's politics were taking a toll on relations between different members of it. While Diana and Unity became closely aligned with British and German fascism, and were joined in that political outlook by their mother Sydney and brother Tom, Jessica, the second youngest sister, was a communist, while Nancy was appalled by Diana's associations in particular. The girl's father, David, was also opposed to German fascism, and the tensions this created with his wife eventually led to their final separation. Deborah, and also to some extent her older sister Pamela, both of whom shared a love for all things rural throughout their lives, became the neutral members of the family, maintaining good relations for the most part with all members, where others had bitter fallings out, notably between Nancy and Diana, and between Jessica and Unity. Deborah later wrote of her sisters, "I do not share Diana's fascist views, but my love for her overcame this side of her character, and Unity was always the odd one out." The British author and biographer Selina Hastings wrote that Deborah was by far the most balanced of all the sisters. She was down to earth. This role as peacemaker and arbitrator made Deborah, who was just 19 at the time that the Second World War broke out, the daughter who headed off with her mother to Europe late in 1939, when Unity showed up in Switzerland with a bullet in her head, having attempted to take her own life on the 3rd of September, the day Britain declared war on Germany. Deborah and her mother chaperoned Unity back to England, but she never recovered from the brain damage which occurred when she shot herself, and died in the late 1940s when the bullet, which could not be removed, changed position in her head. Deborah would remain a stalwart defender of her sister's actions for decades thereafter, clashing with media and even her in-laws when her sister's dubious association with the leaders of Nazi Germany were raised. This aside, Deborah had no affinity for any of National Socialism's political views, but was rather a traditional British conservative throughout her long life, though one who flirted along with her husband with a new liberal movement in the 1980s, as you will see. Her defence of unity was based solely on family loyalty, and long after the war Deborah remained on good terms with all of her surviving siblings. Not long after her trip to Switzerland to fetch unity back from war-torn Europe, Deborah agreed to marry Andrew Cavendish, a younger son of Edward Cavendish, 10th Duke of Devonshire, one of the most senior peers of Britain. They were married in the Priory Church of St Bartholomew the Great in West Smithfield in London in 1941. Shortly afterwards their first child, a boy called Mark, was born on the 14th of November 1941, but he died just minutes after his birth. As we will see, further children came in the years that followed, but Deborah's natal history was complicated. So too was married life. Her brother-in-law William, the heir to the dukedom, was killed in September 1944 while leading a division of the Coldstream Guards, the oldest regiment in the British Army. This occurred in Belgium following the Allied invasion of France and the opening of a Western Front in the summer of that year. William, or Billy as he was known, had married Kathleen Kick Kennedy just 4 months prior. She was a sister of the future president and would face her own tragic end. Despite their brief marriage, this connection placed Deborah in the Kennedy circle, and she and her husband would later be guests of President John F. Kennedy in Washington. With his brother's passing, Andrew became the heir designate, and when his father also died unexpectedly of a heart attack in the early winter of 1950, Andrew succeeded as the 11th Duke of Devonshire. With this, Deborah, who would not have expected to acquire such a title when she married Andrew in 1941, became Duchess of Devonshire. As Duchess of Devonshire, Deborah became the lady of one of Britain's most prized stately homes, Chatsworth House. The Chatsworth estate had first passed into the ownership of the Cavendish family back in 1549 when Sir William Cavendish, a prominent royal official, purchased it. His descendant, William Cavendish, 4th Earl of Devonshire and subsequently 1st Duke of Devonshire, began building the modern house in 1687, which eventually became a sprawling 5-storey 81,000 square metre abode with 300 rooms. His descendant, the 4th Duke, later married Lady Charlotte Boyle, the sole heiress to the vast Boyle estate in Ireland, which brought enormous wealth to the family. Thus, Chatsworth House had flourished as one of the great centres of the British aristocracy in the 18th and 19th centuries. Deborah transformed it into a modern stately home during the 54-year period that she held the title of Duchess alongside her husband as Duke. It was an uphill struggle. Despite the family's historic wealth, they were heavily indebted by the time Andrew and Deborah became Duke and Duchess in 1950. Some £7 million, the equivalent of well over £200 million in today's money, was owed to the government. This was due to extensive wealth taxes which were imposed in Britain after the Second World War and the death duties charged on the passing of the 10th Duke in 1950 on the vast Chatsworth estate. Many of Andrew and Deborah's advisors at this stage believed the financial situation to be unfixable and advised carving up the Chatsworth estate and selling chunks of it, but they took another approach. They decided to sell many valuable works of art, as well as a second 16th century palace, Hardwick Hall. The couple was determined to redevelop Chatsworth and turn it into one of the largest tourist centres in northern England. When Andrew and Deborah took this decision, Chatsworth House itself was run down, as the Dukes of Devonshire had not used it as their primary residence for many years. Instead, it had been leased out as a private girls' boarding school for a time. Accordingly, the house had to be restored. Deborah became the chief decorator in the restoration process, overseeing the repainting and repair of the family rooms and renovating many of the sprawling common areas. By 1959, the house and main grounds were sufficiently well restored to move in. This was just the beginning of a long process. The grounds immediately surrounding the house were transformed by Deborah, with large gardens planted to begin a cottage industry of sorts. The result many years later was a self-sufficient estate, and tourists visiting Chatsworth House today can eat in a restaurant where most of the produce comes from the surrounding farm and gardens. This was expanded later to open Chatsworth Farm Shop. Deborah was fully immersed in the country life. She had dogs, horses and livestock, enjoyed shooting, and hosted a variety of agricultural shows and equestrian events. Eventually, in the 1990s, she even began publishing books on the farm and gardens, notably The Garden at Chatsworth in 1999 and the Chatsworth Cookery Book in 2003. This was just one element of the rejuvenation of Chatsworth. Chatsworth House sits at the centre of a 35,000-acre estate, on which are to be found many important tourist sites, notably the Tudor mansion of Bess of Hardwicke, a famed companion of Queen Elizabeth I. Beyond this, the scenic beauty of the Peak District, in which the estate is located, makes the estate a considerable draw for tourists in northern England. Deborah was front and central to this development in the early years, even manning the ticket office at the house when it first became a tourist site. She also oversaw the establishment and redevelopment of several hotels on or adjoining the estate in Baslow and other villages between the house and the town of Chesterfield. As a result of all of this work, by the 1990s Chatsworth had become one of the most popular tourist destinations in England. This is a substantial part of Deborah's legacy as Duchess. Today, over 500,000 visitors arrive to Chatsworth every year, putting it on the same level as the Tower of London and the Royal Albert Hall. While Chatsworth House became a resounding success under Deborah's stewardship, her family life was strained in many ways. Andrew was repeatedly unfaithful, and this came to public attention when he was called to testify at a burglary trial, in the course of which he was forced to admit that he had been with another woman on the night in question. Deborah tolerated his infidelities for many years, as well as his borderline alcoholism, which he openly wrote about. She eventually confronted this in the 1980s, telling her husband that it was her or the booze. In her memoir she states, "For 2 decades until the day he died, he never had another drink." Deborah also maintained a public show of solidarity, campaigning with him in the 1980s when he became involved with the short-lived Social Democratic Party, a pro-Europe centrist party largely formed out of former members of the Labour Party who were disaffected by its drift to the left at the time. Asked years later why she stayed with her husband, she stated it was because he wasn't boring. Andrew and Deborah's position as parents was also difficult. After the death at birth of Mark in 1941, 2 healthy children, Emma and Peregrine, were born in 1943 and 1944, but thereafter Deborah suffered a miscarriage in 1946 and 2 children who died shortly after they were born in 1947 and 1953. The tragedy of having lost 4 children at a time when such levels of infant mortality were becoming unusual owing to medical advances was somewhat alleviated when a healthy child, whom they named Sophia, was born in 1957. By the late 1990s, Chatsworth House had become a tremendous success, and the Devonshires were able to engage in a wide array of philanthropic activity. For her actions in contributing to the Royal Collection Trust, the largest art collection in the world, Deborah was made a Dame Commander of the Royal Victorian Order by Queen Elizabeth II in 1999. In 2004, Andrew died at 84 years of age, and his and Deborah's only surviving son, Peregrine, succeeded as 12th Duke of Devonshire, a position which he still holds. Following this, Deborah moved out of Chatsworth to make way for her son, and moved back to the old rectory on the Chatsworth estate, where she had lived in the 1950s with her husband. The Cavendish family have been repeatedly featured on the Sunday Times Rich List, and in 2023 it was estimated that their wealth amounted to £905 million, a result of their extensive land holdings and also investment in hotel chains abroad. Deborah's business acumen had not only saved the dukedom from the financial difficulties it had been in during the 1950s, but had made the Cavendishes once again one of England's wealthiest aristocratic families. Deborah died on the 24th of September 2014 at 94 years of age. By that time, she had been the last surviving Mitford sister for over a decade, Diana having died in 2003 and Pamela and Jessica before her in the mid-1990s. At her funeral, over 600 staff, hundreds of members of the public, and even members of the royal family lined the route from Chatsworth House to St. Peter's Church at Exile, where she was buried. Elvis, her favourite musician, was played at the funeral. Deborah Mitford, Dowager Duchess of Devonshire, was survived by her son and 2 daughters, as well as 8 grandchildren and 18 great-grandchildren. It was a fitting end to the eccentric and controversial Mitford sisters. Thank you so much for watching this video on the Mitford sisters. I hope you found it interesting, and if you watched it the whole way through, a special thanks to you. If you want more long type videos like this, be sure to let me know down below in the comments, and if you have any other suggestions of people you would like covered, also be sure to leave them down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.